Hello and welcome to the Game Dev Local Podcast. I'm your host, Oscar Clark, he, him pronouns, and I'm on a podquest to learn everything you wanted to know about game dev, but never dared to ask. And I'm delighted to be joined by Catalin. Catalin, tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do.
Hey Oscar, thanks for the invite. I am a behavioral game economist, which means I meld together economics, behavioral science, and game design to design essentially economic models from scratch for games. The same way free to play is an economic model,
Yeah,
premium plus. All of these are models. Essentially, I come in and work with clients to build from scratch rather than the more traditional approach, which is you take one out of the box and you try and maximize it and optimize it as much as possible.
absolutely. And I think this is a kind of massively interesting area for those who know me and the stuff I do. I'm hugely fascinated by the whole field of economics applied to games, particularly behavioral economics. You know, the likes of free economics, queer economics, all those kind of writers I find fascinating. Dan Arley, I used to feel very, very passionately excited about, and less so nowadays, given some complications, shall we say, in some of his evidence. But I think a lot of what he and others like him have talked about, the idea of the application of not an idealized consumer, that a perfect expression of the what good looks like from the mathematics side of an economics question, but looking at the psychological aspects of behavior applied to all kinds of models, like you say, premium product. So, I mean, I've kind of thrown my kind of hat in the ring a little bit there, but for you, what is the core of behavioral economics and how it applies to games?
So I have a less than traditional approach in
Mm-hmm.
the sense that when you hear behavioral economist, first of all, you think economics degree,
Yep.
academic, or psychology degree.
Yep.
Um, and I don't really come at it from that angle.
Yep.
Um, I come at it from the angle of someone who's built, like who's applied a lot of that. It's very much
Yep.
on the application side, and has use for theory and research in as much as it can be applied.
Yeah.
I'm not really interested in I try and deploy the latest frameworks that I can find and try and incorporate as much as possible. But at the same time, I'm not interested in debating the theoretical merits of, some types of research over the other, or so this study is slightly more complete than the other.
Yeah.
That's not really my focus because at the end of the day, I'm trying to get a very clear outcome and use the most pragmatic way of getting there.
Mm. And so, in terms of that outcome, so I'm again, I'm making an assumption. I'm assuming that particularly gameplay data, behavioral information,
Yeah,
sentiment, insight are the kind of drivers for you. Is that the right kind of thing that I'm thinking about?
it's not a driver; it's
Okay.
a feedback mechanism.
Yeah.
It's just measurement. I think there's been a huge bias in the last 10 to 15 years because it works. It's worked. It works in certain market conditions that were prevalent in the last 10 to 15 years. That measurement can pretty much become the driver. Like you can see things, working in real time. So all you have to do is put more fuel on that fire, get more UA going, add more events, whatever it is, and you see that feedback in real time, and you can just keep doing more of
Yeah.
that. But when the market conditions change, which is what happened with IDFA, for instance,
Exactly.
that becomes less of a winning strategy, and
Mm.
you get this type of environment where people are scrambling right now.
And I think that's really, for me personally, I think that's fundamental to where we are today. Again, maybe it's because of my bias, having sort of spent so much time working with rewarded ads when in the early days when we were working on making that a thing. Particularly because my focus to try to evangelize Unity ads was to tell designers how to design games using it. I didn't want to sell you ads on how much money you'd make. I wanted to sell you ads on what they would do to make the player experience better. Now, whether that was right or not, I mean, that's down to people's personal opinion. But I mean, I think you mentioning IDFA, I think is a fundamental shift because of the choice that Apple took to frame the questions about whether you would share data or not. That's my personal take on it. What's your Why does the IDFA matter to you though?
So it was a weird time in the
Mm,
2011s, 2012s, because you had all these like it all seemed settled. It seemed like the end of history
yeah,
in games. It seemed all solved. So essentially, the idea was Apple would give you essentially they'd feature you, or they would send they'd build this ecosystem where you could get very cheap UA, and that worked for a very long time. And it was assumed that it would just constantly keep working. And it also was viewed as the mobile developer's birthright. Like if you're on
yeah,
Apple, you can build games a lot a lot cheaper, and you can get cheaper UA, and you can get this flywheel going. And essentially, it's so much more agile, more nimble than the console
yeah,
ecosystem. But Apple was always going to like they have no allegiance. They're a company. They're a publicly traded company. They don't owe
yeah,
anyone anything. But this, the IDFA was being taken for granted. It was, oh, we will always have that because Apple needs us to succeed because we sell their phones. But the truth is, people buy iPhones because they're iPhones,
yeah,
and they get mobile. They get mobile games as sort of an accessory as you get like a phone case or a nice Bluetooth speaker or whatever.
yeah.
But that's not why they buy iPhones. I mean, you don't get an iPhone because they have game exclusives or anything like that.
No,
Right?
no.
So Apple had the bargaining power to
Yep.
impose IDFA.
Oh, exactly. And I think what's interesting there for me is that uh, you, I would argue that again, maybe it's because I'm old and I was doing mobile Java games as an operator back in like 2003.
I tested Java games, so
Yeah, yeah,
maybe
exactly.
I'm
But
a
because
bit of an old.
we were the largest revenue per user in the world, at three. Which is like laughable because like the whole industry was basically what Supercell make a month. I mean, I'm not quite sure that's true, but it's not far off the order of magnitude. But the thing that for me made the whole mobile games industry take off was the fact that we could use ads to target, and we had the benefit of focused retail on very dedicated devices. So it went from the game was something I would get to kind of show off the device, which is literally how we made so much money, was because we had games like Carmageddon in 3D making as much money as we were making on Tetris, because it was the game people who bought the A1000 had to get to show off what the phone could do. But there wasn't a sustainable long term way to generate necessarily revenue for games, although I had other techniques. So I think from going from that stage to a stage where words with friends is something that when she was still alive, my mother-in-law was using as a thing that she did on a regular basis. That transition to me only came about because of that ability to unlock the power of targeted advertising and the power of the retail store at the same time.
I
Does that
agree.
make sense?
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I
Mm,
would say I'd be very careful around the distinction between sustainable and scalable
mm, mm.
because I do think it was a sustainable business. I
Yeah,
don't think it was scalable
no,
in that it couldn't get to the hundreds of millions of users that you have now because you had to get people buy games off operator portals
yeah.
for a dollar 50 per game, and they weren't really that engaging. And
Well, we were charging, I think it was £20 for the Carmageddon game at the time. This is
oh my god,
2005 or
oh my
six.
days, that is
Yeah,
yeah. I'm sure there was some premium ones.
yeah, but this was a bygone era where we had the scope to experiment,
Yeah,
and the established dollar price, the base 99 cent price, had not happened yet. I launched games at £6. I then released them. I reduced them 6 weeks later to £3, and I reduced them 6 weeks after that to £1, and then I took them off the deck. So I was unique in doing that which is why I made 9 times the revenue of every other European operator.
Well, yeah.
And I
I
know that
mean,
only because somebody accidentally sent me the data of the other UK teams.
well, if you had
Um,
Carmageddon and it
yeah,
was 3D, I mean,
yeah,
that would have driven a lot more sales than I don't know, Snake or
absolutely, absolutely. But
yeah,
Tetris, which is still probably the biggest game at the era when Jammed Out was sold to EA.
Jammed that. Yeah,
Yeah, and who set up? Who was behind Jammed Out? Javier, Scopely. So
yeah.
it's amazing how interconnected that world is. Anyway, I'm diverging. We want to talk about the behavioral side. So, what is the implication of that removal of IDFA from your point of view? What is the implication in terms of the player's behavior post that moment?
Right. So I think if you have infinite data on someone,
Yeah,
if you say you wave a magic wand, you're invisible, you can go in their house,
yeah.
you can look through their software, you can look through their, not through their browser history, but like you can actually look at them browsing the internet in real time for hours, months, years. You will be able to predict so well what they want or what they would buy, not necessarily what they want, that it's just like it would be it would be like mind control. Like you would be able to give them such a customized thing that they just wouldn't be able to resist it.
Well, I'm not sure. I'm quite convinced that it's that extreme. I do
Oh, it's
think that
not. It's not.
you're, yeah,
I'm giving the most extreme
no, sure,
version of
but
the hamburgers.
I think what you are saying is that when you take data, because the view I have on this is I don't think we gain as much from an individual behavioral data point as we do from the cohort of
Yeah,
data because of statistical significance, because of individual
yeah.
variation,
Law of large numbers. Yeah, for
all of
sure.
those things. Law of large numbers, yeah. So I actually welcome the fact that we now have more privacy because it's less intrusive. I'm not sure the removal of IDFA specifically gave us that, but that's a different subject.
Yeah,
Uh, I am biased. I did give some advice to the Information Commission Office in the UK on best practice for data collection for developers. So I would have a bias on wanting that to be done as authentically and as ethically as possible. Um, but I think the value of pre IDFA was that I could test huge amounts of small variations with smaller audiences and get sufficient information to know whether the green button or the red button was more effective. And
yeah,
doing
but
that at scale meant that I had so many choices of what I could identify about which would shift the needle for that revenue metric. Does that make sense?
sure. But what enables that scale? What enabled the only thing that enabled that scale was cost. It was cheaper to do.
Well, it was cheaper to do, but I think it's also the level of detail that you could get out of any specific test was there.
I mean, yes, you could get a certain level of detail, but I think you can still get most of that using other tools.
Yeah.
This isn't necessarily UA isn't necessarily my main area of
No, no,
expertise.
no, sure. I'm just thinking about in
Um,
terms of the pool of data, though. What IDFA did for me is it
yeah,
meant that there's a distortion in the picture of the overall data, which is a big absence of something like 70% of Apple users, as opposed to Android users. Although there is that's kind of become a little bit less clear. Um, to me, it means that there's gaps in the data where the tyranny of averages is affecting us. So the fact that what we see as the average of the person who is going to say yes to supplying data is going to be different from the actual average of the actual player.
right. But Apple still has that data.
Apple
It's
does,
the
but we
developer that
don't.
doesn't.
Yeah,
Yes,
yeah,
but Apple has their own tools
yeah,
that they've essentially gated
yeah,
behind
yeah,
using their ecosystem, their ad networks. So you can still go and use that. It's just
yeah.
more expensive.
It's more expensive, but I also don't find I'd not seen someone turn around to me and say that was magical and really worked. Um, I'm just saying, from my experience, I'm finding that okay, it's good for that audience, but it's not really helping me deliver a games experience across the market. It's helping a bit, it's helping that bit, but it's not giving me the level of information I used to have to understand what people were doing. And maybe I'm
Right.
being
So
unfair. Maybe I'm not talking to the right people.
it's your contention that in right now there's
Yeah,
basically no solution that was comparable to pre IDFA.
in my opinion, yeah,
Right. But the way you would need to do that is a publisher would need to launch their own phone with their own app store and their own OS and their own stack, collect their own data,
yeah.
or
Oh,
a
I'm not
solution
saying
of
it's fixable, but it also,
right. But
I'm not necessarily even saying I think it's necessarily a bad thing. I think in some
yeah,
ways it's. Do you know what I think it is? I was complaining back in like 2014, 15
yeah,
that we weren't using branding enough. What we were using, and this is a guy who was promoting, you know, data, you know, performance based marketing. I'm literally promoting performance based marketing, but I was kind of frustrated that people were ignoring the benefit of value based, you know, brand based
yeah.
experiences. And I've always felt that they need to be something, you know, you need the data to keep you honest, and you need the emotion to get people to care. And I don't see them as contradictory. I see them as mutually beneficial. But I felt like we were leaning too heavily on the data to get the number up rather than why the number was going up. Is that making any sense?
It makes all the sense because that's exactly what's happening
Hmm.
still. I mean, there's
Yeah,
some
sure.
shift toward quote unquote brand formance. I mean,
Yeah.
that's the new buzzword,
Brand
isn't it?
performance. I've not
Yeah, I
heard
know.
that one. That's a great one.
Oh,
Brand performance.
you
I will
know,
not be using that one.
oh, it's really it's getting traction.
Yeah.
It's apparently what Supercell is doing, and I think
Yeah.
it's on mobile dev memo as well used. But anyway,
Mm.
uh, the there is this tension between the two.
Yeah.
Um, I I think the big complaint against IDFA was it made that type of driving numbers up via UA. It made it harder. It made
Yeah.
it more expensive. So I think there's um, how to put it. I think we've got into multiple subjects, so we need to
Mm.
sort of collapse them into
Go for it.
one manageable. Right. So I'm not necessarily sure that to go back to your first to the first subject that we got into. I'm not necessarily sure that the type of optimization that IDFA enabled was that much more valuable to the final experience of the game. I think you
That's
would
fair.
get whether you could test, if a button is blue, does that convert better? I mean, that can be true this year, and then next year it isn't. So uh,
Absolutely.
you have to keep testing. But at the same time, if you are coming in with a Fortnite type game 8 years after Fortnite on mobile, and all you're interested in testing in is the blue button going to convert, then you've already lost. Like
You're
that's
completely
already
lost. Yeah.
yeah, exactly.
But
So
this is why we have qualitative and quantitative kind of perspectives on looking at data. This is why I think the emotion, you know, why data tells you what has worked or not. It doesn't tell you what will work or not. That to me is kind of fundamental. So you know that
but
for me,
in
this
mobile,
comes
it
back.
does though.
Hmm?
I mean, in mobile, that's what everything is based on. That the data tells you what will keep working,
Yeah.
essentially forever, as long as you put more and more and more and more UA money into it.
Yeah.
Like that is the essential, and you tweak, just the little surface thing. You add one more, like there's a new type of event that everyone's kind of using, and you add that into the rotation,
Hmm.
or a new mini game, or a new creative that someone's come up with that's a little bit more shocking, and you incorporate that, you build a
Yeah.
feature that was in the creative, and you do creative against you do UA against that.
Yeah.
But that was the big appeal. That's the big appeal, I
Hmm.
think, of mobile. Otherwise, you would not be able to have the scale that it's operating in. It
No,
would
no,
still be huge scale, just not as big.
But it's interesting because I think this is why we get into trouble. Sky News made a big piece about misogynistic advertising and also
Yeah,
misogynistic context. But I think the reason why those things happen isn't necessarily that somebody is intentionally being unpleasant.
exactly.
Well, they
Thank
might
you.
be, but they're not thinking about
Yeah,
the political ramifications. They're thinking about what is going to push the needle, what's going to push the number, and they're not thinking about the consequences or the shadow that it casts.
I mean, I don't think if you were to assume that what you see in mobile advertising is a direct effect of advertisers' beliefs or the people who make the creative their
Yeah.
beliefs, you would have to believe that it's run by 40% fetishists,
Yeah.
like
Oh yeah.
with the amount of fetish
No.
ads, and that's just statistically impossible.
Yeah.
So yeah, absolutely. I find it so disingenuous because a lot of people in when you're in mobile UA, they had these campaigns, I think, a year ago. They keep having them with like, oh, ban misogynistic ads in games, and then they go and do it because you pretty much can't. Like you would just not be able to do your job,
Yeah.
essentially because of the way the ecosystem is structured. You would not be able to get that low CPI, that you need in order to deliver results for your client. So you're out there on LinkedIn going, yeah, ban misogynistic ads. And then on your blog, you're going like 10 fake ad creatives that win in 2025.
Yeah.
That's just, it's silly. It's
It's great.
just,
But also, I
yeah,
think let's go back. Take us back to the kind of whole behavioural psychological approach to it. To
yeah,
me, there's something more effective where we can start to unpick the why of the data. And the trouble is that everybody has a reason why something worked after the event, but that's not necessarily what the why is. So how can we use behavioral kind of approaches to understand what's going on? What are the most effective ways that we can think differently than just look at the number and see it goes up?
right. So there are, um, uh, there are several different takes here. The the temptation is to use behavioral science and to apply it on kind of the tangible details of improved monetization, of optimizing, stuff that's easily measurable,
Yeah,
um, first time user experience, whatever it is. And the larger temptation is to break it into hacks, into these nudge kind of
yeah,
things, and to get these popular science books, like just get a list of tactics from them, list of hacks that work, and go like, oh, you make this color, or you use choice architecture to, or price anchoring, whatever it is, right? There's this list of popular
and
hacks that,
half of them have been disproved in at scale as well, which is I think
yeah,
no one talks about that bit.
the replication
Yeah.
crisis is something completely different. I mean,
Particularly you mentioned
that is a
nudging,
different level.
because that
Yeah,
that's a very that's been adopted by a number of governments
it
and
has. Yeah.
found not to be functional at scale.
It is, yeah, I think it's very context dependent.
Yes, yeah, sorry, yeah, that's fair. Sorry, I'm being a bit, I'm painting it a bit kind of wide, but I mean,
No, it is. It has been found in many contexts that were assumed to be where you'd assume it to be functional.
yeah,
It hasn't, because it depends.
yeah,
But to me, the problem isn't does nudging work? Is nudging, is the replication crisis, something that affects the credibility? The the whole underpinning of modern psychology, there are these frameworks like self-determination theory that we know work, essentially,
yeah,
right? It's where you start going into specific implementation that it gets dicey.
exactly, yeah, yeah, yeah,
So essentially, I think you're pretty safe, and this is a lot of where I incorporate it in my work. I'm not really. It's something I choose not to do, but it's also something that I don't think works very well. For It's not really transformational. You can optimize a little bit. You can go in the store and go, okay, you should use these colors. You should, I don't
yeah,
know, add sprinkles on this, add more VFX on this, make it more visible, use contrast, like all those things. Bundle this, price anchor this. there's not, there's nothing at this price point where you need something at this price point. There's nothing, use more cosmetics because it's a game where there's status is important and whatever. It's an Animal Crossing game,
Yeah.
and status is important because you want to show off to your friends. So put more cosmetics in and less boosters. That's all fine. That's fine and dandy. There are a billion people doing that, and I think most of them, you can do that job fairly easily just based on data. And I think a lot of that is probably going to go to AI. Like you'll probably have a little LLM going, hey man, like I looked at your screenshots of your store, and you could use more of that type of
Mm.
IAP and that type and that type.
But there's a
And
couple of things I want to unpack in that. So one, you talked about cosmetic. I'll come up that second, but the
yeah,
AI thing. One of the issues in there, for my mind, obviously there's a lot of people who have a lot of adverse feelings about AI. I understand those. I'm not trying to sort of like get into that political argument. I kind of sit on both sides of that. But one of the things about that for me is there's a reduction to the mean that I think happens with that processing. Because at the end of the day, we are talking about what data is out there, what things are out there. What always
yeah.
strikes me is the surprises we get are, I think, when somebody steps out of that standardization and creates an identity, like an experience that has sufficient familiarity, but is also distinct. And I'm not sure how useful, I think it is useful, I don't think it's how useful using an LLM to do that distinctive step. Does that make
I don't think
sense?
it's useful at all.
Yeah.
It makes sense, but I don't think it's useful at all.
Mm,
I don't think LLMs can do that.
mm,
There's no real evidence to show that they can do
yeah.
that because
Well, quite the
they've
opposite.
been. Yeah, exactly. It's the opposite. You would have expected a masterpiece novel by now. You
Mm,
would have expected a masterpiece novella at the very least.
mm,
You would have expected a masterpiece painting or illustration, not just Ghiblify a Cybertruck,
yeah.
right? Like create a new style as compelling as the Ghibli style. And some people have, the people who have done that, it's always around the compelling part of it is always their personal intention and their personal brand, and it's not even that compelling. Like it's very much, oh, I'm a hobbyist first year, film student, and I've done my Beatles tribute, film. So I have a lot of yeah. And I'm not really AI pilled at all at the minute. I think it's got some good
Yeah,
applications,
yeah.
search and whatnot. But anything that's based on data and on stochastic,
But using it to find
stuff is good.
patterns that we don't yet can't see because of the scale of the data, I think is incredibly valuable. But then
Yes,
interpreting those patterns, I think it's still something that humans are better at, personally.
it is, but to be very blunt, in mobile, that's not really that valuable because it's not how mobile works. Mobile works by finding something that is successful, optimizing it a little bit more for revenue, and getting money to fund the UA spend against that.
It's basically um, how much paid UA can we get on a thing that creates,
We know works.
that we know works. Yeah, and finding the thing that
Yeah,
works is not always about the emotional value associated with it.
yeah. I mean, there are. It's very fraught now because I came up in mobile. I was a mobile game designer. I was a specific game designer for most of my career
Mm.
before kind of veering into specifically economy design and kind of more that side of things. Um, Indeed, there are so many games now that were great when they started and they still are great, but I don't think that's what the market's making anymore. We're not getting a lot of Hearthstones and Pokemon Go's. We're getting a lot of 3D mallet, screwball, duck, squirrel, and with ads in.
Well, I mean, I think that's true. There's a lot of that. I personally feel I have more hope. Maybe it's misplaced. Maybe it's because I want to see more games that I care about. I do
Yeah, me
feel
too.
that the mobile. I am passionate about the potential that mobile devices have for great gaming experiences. Um, but the thing is, like you say, the scale comes with people who already have scale.
Yeah.
at the end of the day, and that is a massive challenge. And I wonder if the current circumstances that we've had in the games industry over the last couple of years will right that or make that worse. And my fear is that currently it's making that worse because, ironically, I think the attempts to fix privacy, the attempts to kind of fix bad practice in app store processes, and also protection of vulnerable people, I think the implementation of those that we're being forced down by legislation makes it even harder for small companies than ever before.
I agree with some of that. I think, yeah, you can point to GDPR, for
Yeah.
instance, being quite more draconic than it needs to be and more convoluted.
And
But
that's the
I don't,
easy one. Age appropriate
yeah,
design code, the UK one, no longer allows you to assume that someone's over 18 by using a credit card. You have to have physical proof, a birth certificate, passport level of proof. And who holds that data? Now, that to me is a massive phishing exercise bonanza if we don't enforce the platforms to manage that. If the
so
developers
I
do it, we're
agree.
screwed.
There you go. It's a systems
Yeah,
problem. And you were asking about how can we deploy sort of behavioral science or behavioral
yeah,
economics to fix that. That is coming at it not from the optimization
yeah,
angle of how do we necessarily optimize the lowest level, the furthest branch on that systemic tree,
yeah,
and like how do we deploy behavioral science to optimize that, and like if we make the button, the age verification button blue, like is that going to get fewer kids
yeah.
to sign up? No, that's
No,
not right. So you need to follow it back to
yeah,
the root and
exactly.
deploy it kind of at the root of that tree, and figure out what the core drivers are in the system, like at the base of the system.
So, I mean, I don't just look at mobile, I look at PC or console games and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
My particular interest is in live ops, or I want to create experiences people want to play over a very extended period. Because to my mind, that's the goal. If I can create something that you play, whether that's hours a day or dip in 20 minutes a day, that's not particularly my worry. My worry is if I'm going to create an experience, I want you to care about it. And if you care about it, you're going to stay playing. And I think that's interesting. If we're coming at that point of view, my view is that you've got to have an authentic love of what the gameplay is about, whether it's a mobile style thing or whether it's a PC style thing. If we're going to do that, I feel like we've got to understand why the players do something, not just what the players do. Is that where behavioral economic kind of principles, psychological kind of principles can play a major part in the design process?
They absolutely can, and they have.
Mm,
Only the problem with the the platform is you don't really need that. You don't need that to achieve your financial goals. You don't need that to achieve your engagement goals, and you can see that with probably one of the best mobile games that could ever be created, TikTok.
mm.
I think TikTok
It's a game.
is the
Yeah.
final evolution of the mobile game because it gives you variable reward in terms of content. It gives you one good video, two ones, another good one, six bad ones, another good one, or like four good ones. It's variable reward. It doesn't have the friction point. It doesn't put up a difficulty spike. It doesn't put up it doesn't have that pinch that a
Mm.
lot of mobile games do. It doesn't have a skill curve either.
But but those
So
things you're mentioning, like the difficulty, the challenge, the
yeah,
payoff, they all create meaning. So that point where I want to throw the phone out the window or I want to throw my controller through my TV screen is an important part of what makes me love games.
yeah, it's what makes you love games. What makes me love games.
Yeah.
But we look at it, I think, from a perspective. And again, this is where behavioral economics comes in with player motivations. I'm sure you're familiar
Hmm.
with the framework
Hmm.
because that's probably the most used kind of form of behavioral science or that used by game makers and by sort of quote unquote pundits. But that's where it comes in because we are gamers. We, I think, were there for the start of mobile, where the assumption was that it would turn into some sort of console.
Hmm.
And I know, when I was developing, because I worked on some of the first big franchises ported to iPhone, and the idea was like Command and Conquer,
Yeah.
um, Medal of Honor. We were making console games for the phone. They're fully 3D. And the idea was to make them fully, premium and console on mobile. And
Hmm.
that was the point. But like, that's not what mobile ended up being. Mobile ended up being something completely different. And to reach that scale, it needed a completely different type of audience who just does not care about. They care about familiarity. They care about comfort. They care about zoning out and about essentially teleporting through time. Coming out the other end of 2 hours without having to think about anything else. And that's what they care about. They don't care about, and I'm not saying this in a pejorative way. I'm not saying that they're bad people or they're bad gamers or any of that, because it doesn't matter.
But to my mind, there's what that means to me to make the kind of experiences I want to make. I think there's a stratification of what kind of experiences we're trying to do, and I think we have to understand that there is that audience, and that is a
Yeah,
large, probably the majority audience that wants that distraction with no pressure. But I don't think that's the only use case out there. I think even for those players, I think there's a mode of use that's addressing, and a lot of those players have other modes of use, other points in their daily routine where they're looking for other things. Now, I get you. I agree with you that at scale, if you're talking about the higher scale, the $1 billion games or the $1 billion experiences, if we have friction of in that experience, it's going to cause problems. But I still believe that there's ways of creating really genuine narrative and playful and meaningful experiences through gameplay that can scale sufficiently to be not just viable but genuinely successful and impactful. I think we see
I,
that.
I don't
Yeah.
disagree. I don't
Yeah.
disagree. I think we are talking about, for what, something like 13, 14, 15 years, the gospel of mobile has been scaled.
Yeah.
You go for the biggest possible market and you try and monetize it as much as possible,
Yeah.
but because you know you're going to be monetizing a small percent, you try and get the largest number of people
Mm.
possible. So it's a huge mindset shift for anyone in mobile,
Yeah.
for anyone to come in and tell them, you know what, now you have to go after niches. You have to go after narrative interested
But this just
players.
sounds like 101 marketing. I think I can't remember if it was Kotler or whatever, but it was like niche versus sorry, commodity versus niche. That's a fundamental basic principle of economics in general rather than just games.
So I don't disagree with you. The thing is with mobile,
Yeah.
because platforms are structured in ways we don't really intuitively understand as game
Yeah.
makers. They are so mind-bogglingly huge
Yeah.
that, and the audiences are so dynamic, and the
Yeah.
preferences shift from this to that instantly, driven by by algorithms, as social media kind of just driving people from thing to thing almost instantly. It's very hard to say. Right. So let me, first of all, I think there's an even deeper layer to this. There was a Newzoo report, I think, 2024, 2023, where they found about, I hope I'm not misquoting this, especially as I'm sure I know ex Newzoo people who will correct me if I'm wrong.
Yes. So do
Um,
I.
but about 40% overlap between hardcore, quote unquote, hardcore gamers, like console and PC gamers, and mobile gamers.
Yeah.
So it's less than you'd expect. It's not really, the majority of the audience is not the same audience.
Absolutely not.
So you can go for that
Yeah.
40%, but that 40%, once you start slicing it up, the UA economics just collapse
Yeah.
essentially.
But I think that's
So
what I think we're going to be saying here is that there's a disconnect between discovery and user acquisition and quality. And actually, I'm going to go so far as I think that we have lost probably 75% of potential mobile players. I mean, maybe I'm over exaggerating, but I think if you look at what happened when Pokemon Go first arrived, it was literally bigger than everything else on the app stores by an order of magnitude.
Yeah,
So, to my mind, that means that we have an untapped audience, an audience that has tapped out of our ecosystem completely because we have doubled down on the number crunching paid UA process. And
yeah,
I think
hundred
that's a
percent.
fundamental opportunity. But how on earth do you bridge that gap? Because we now have created this assumption that games, well, not just games, but apps are there to exploit, users. Is that fair?
Yeah, no, it's absolutely fair. I think it's a very very succinct and comprehensive view of the problem, and there's no silver bullet, but it's also the it's not because it's very easy, and I've done it too, to blame guys who like monetization guys who preach the gospel of fake ads,
Yeah,
or there are plenty of economists, like academic economists working games, and go like, oh, you should really optimize that more, like squeeze some more IP out of that, or Nintendo should do free to play, or
yeah,
all that jazz. And it's just it's easy to blame them, but the real issue is the economics of the ecosystem works at the minute to create returns for investors.
yeah,
Like
exactly.
people know that right now, if they go and put 200 billion in something like a Monopoly Go, chances are they will get their money back if the spend is high enough, if the IP is good enough, and the team is world class. You can still get that money, and what that means is you're going to have to flood all of the channels and raise UA prices for new entrants.
Yeah,
So that means the ecosystem is broken. So to be able to mitigate that, I mean, you almost have to come out from, like, basically come in through the window because the door is closed. So there's no, like, it needs some lateral
yeah.
approach to it.
And I think this is why I think particularly in PC space and console space, the role of streaming has been really important because it's about seeing somebody you identify with playing a game. But even that becomes very paid UA like.
Yeah.
So I mean, I still believe there's chances to do some really interesting things through authentic design and through authentic community development. But the question is, can that be done at scale when there is this big noisy thing going on, like paid UA on mobile? You're seeing the huge amounts of ad volume that's going on. It's really hard to be heard above that cacophony, isn't it?
Well, I think we've had this tradition of 20, 30 years of quote unquote creatives
Yeah,
coming in and making us think about how creative they are and how they are very, very important to the industry, and telling execs, you're just a suit, you don't get it, man. And then some of them, they create a hit, and it's very unique, and it screams creativity, and it does well. It has an audience, and that model worked for such a long time. But when it got appended by this data driven, we don't really need an author to come in and tell us, let's do an Ayn Rand game that's got a saturated color palette, because he dreamt it up and that works, right? Like, we don't need that anymore because we have data that says we can do, I don't know, a 4x, a space 4x, a fantasy 4x with a farming metagame, and do numbers, guaranteed. So once that happened, to come back in and say, well, actually, you need some of that creative stuff. You need some of that lateral thinking. Like, you have to put it in terms that make business sense,
yeah,
because that's the ecosystem right now. That's the environment. That's the world we're living in. I don't think we're going to go back to someone like a Hideo Kojima coming in and going like, let's do a Death Stranding with lots and lots of microtransactions, and it's going to be authorial. It's going to be creative and it's going to transform the mobile market. No, it's not, because it's not how the mobile market works. But where I think we can have that, not unbridled creativity, but disciplined, pragmatic innovation, is in economic models. And I think those have always driven mobile. And I think there are some very, very, uh, promising ones that are just completely ignored right now. I'm looking at Path of Exile and Tarkov, and
Yeah.
they are just, a lot of people just don't have any idea how those work. They look at the genre, they look at the tangible details, and a lot of people are just like, "Oh, there's a secondary market in that? Like how? Oh, you mean there's player trading in that?" Or player trading doesn't work on mobile because they tried it in I don't know, Heyday or whatever, and it didn't work. It didn't do that well. Like that's not. I mean, yeah, they tried a little bit. Nothing is going to work right off the bat, but you can see it working. And again, you're coming at it from a mobile first kind of thinking where that's not necessarily what's going to solve it. So this is part of why I try and work on at the economic model level rather than the lower kind of monetization level. You should do this IEP or that IEP. So whatever IEP you do right now, if you don't have the UA portion sorted, it doesn't really matter that much.
So it sounds
So
like what you're
so
saying is that we need to be thinking more about innovating in the economic model and kind of like living with, accepting that the data and the paid UA is going to drive the scale that we're going to get, and if we ignore that, we're going to fail in our decisions. Is that a reasonable summary?
I think the first two-thirds of that, yes. I don't know that I agree with the. I mean, yeah, paid UA is going to drive it. You kind of have to accept that, but the main effort has been to kind of to be able to get UA cheaper, right? But to be able to get it cheaper from Apple Oven, from Apple, from basically all of these suppliers, on the assumption that the economic model in the game itself, you shouldn't mess with that because that works. But what I'm saying is the main way to lower CPI has been to have a creative game,
Yeah.
a new genre, a new model. That's been the main way to lower CPI. So if we get back to that in a pragmatic and disciplined way, it doesn't need to be this haphazard explosion of unbridled creativity that's hugely risky on someone else's money, because economic models can be rationally evolved and they can still be based on paid UA, but you won't pay as much because the CPI is going to be lower, because there are a lot of people obviously who want different models, who don't want the pinch, who don't want um, a battle pass that they're gonna get sunk into, and they're basically trapped there forever. And if they want to start a new game, they're gonna be like, "Oh, I have to start the battle pass all over again and my whole collection all over again." So does that make sense?
Yeah,
Does
it
that
does.
answer the
I think
question?
what we're saying here, I think, is that there's whilst that we what we've been talking about has shown that there are some stratifications in the industry and there are some barriers in the industry. There is still space, and it may not be in the going back to the kind of auteur-led design model
Yeah,
for the game itself necessarily. Not that we can't have creativity in the game design, but more that we
yeah,
should be applying our creativity as much in the economic design of our game as we do in the way that we acquire users, as we do in the way that we design the experience.
yeah. Perfect. That's it. Ship it.
Perfect.
That's
So thank you very much for that. It's been fantastic. If people want to find out more about what you're doing, what's the best way for them to reach out to you?
So there's my fairly spicy LinkedIn, Catalin Alexandru, and there's my newsletter, Intrinsic Economies on Substack. Other than that, I just did a panel at GamesBeat, with Michael Pachter.
Michael's always
That's
fun.
another. Yeah, no, he is. And Warren Spector showed up at the end and he asked a question and I just fanboyed out, but I don't regret anything. Yeah. Anyways, yeah. No, those are the best ways to find me.
Brilliant,
Yeah.
Catalin. Thank you so much for that. And if you've enjoyed this, please like, subscribe, share, and all the usual stuff. But also, talk to us. There's a Discord in the Game Dev Local group. Tell us what you think and ask questions, because that's the whole point of this, is that we're trying to help anyone who's interested in making games to think differently, more widely about what the possibilities are. And I think what Catalin is talking about here, about this idea of looking at other areas where we can be creative, where we can look at not just the data, but try to get under the bonnet of why these things work, and to think about the psychological parameters as well as the fundamental drivers of audience and scale. Those things are going to help us become better game makers and more successful ones. And on that note, this has been your Game Dev Local. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Oscar.